All right, so now we get into the really exciting stuff. We're going to look at how we can get this kind of behavior that we see in Houdini, where we can just draw out sort of new curves and see the pathfinding in all of its action and all of its glory. We want to set up the same kind of behavior inside of our Scriptable tool inside of Unreal. Okay, so this means we're going to need to address a couple of things. First of all, we need to figure out how we can actually interactively sort of click and add points onto a terrain with a Scriptable tool in Unreal. Then we need to figure out how we're going to pipe all of that data and information into this pathfinding tool. Okay, that also means we're going to need to think about how do we actually pipe the terrain into the tool. We don't want to be sending the terrain every single time we interact with the tool. So I think what I'm going to look at doing is setting this up to optionally use sort of a cached terrain on disk. Okay, so maybe let's go ahead and do that first of all. Jumping inside of the Pegasus terrain pathfinding, we're going to put in a little switch if statement here. I'm going to add another null, and I'm going to call this in external terrain. So this is a terrain that's being provided inside of Houdini or Unreal if you wanted to. And we're going to wire this into the first input. And we're also going to put down a test input. It's going to be the second input. We're going to say element count, and if the number of primitives is greater than 0, so that means if there are any primitives on this incoming geometry here, we're going to use it. Otherwise, we'll use the left input. Okay, so let's just double check that's worked. Okay, so you can see that when we have primitives coming in, it uses the right input, but if we disconnect this here, it uses the left input. So this is just a simple check to say switch if piping in terrain. Okay. So that means that if we don't want to, if we don't have anything piped in, so let's go and disconnect this now. We're going to use the left input. And for the left input, we're actually just going to specify a file. Okay. So this file is going to be sort of terrain or external cached terrain, or yeah, just whatever you want to call it. And let's go back and now kind of modify our pathfinding tool, add a new parameter. We can add a path to that file on disk. Now this should look familiar already, because if we jump back over to Unreal, we can see that if we run the tool, we are referencing a spline file, inside of here. So we're essentially just setting it up to reference an external geometry file, an external terrain file. Okay, so that allows us to sort of pre-compute our terrain stuff. So that's now been dealt with, and it says that it requires an input. So let's just hook this up to the correct sort of the correct terrain object, which I believe we can find. If I go here, go to the spline tool, it's sort of it's in the same location there. So sorry, I got a little bit lost. This is where it is for me. So in this case, I don't think I've actually cached out the terrain mesh that I want to use yet. Yeah, so I've cached out the height field, but I actually want to work with the mesh after I did the preparation on it. So we're going to put down a new ROP geometry output. I'm going to make sure that we're outputting this terrain mesh. And I'm going to call this Pegasus 24 pathfinding mesh. So this is the pre-computed terrain to do the pathfinding on, which means I can now use that. There it is, Pegasus 24 pathfinding mesh. Okay. So we can now see that despite the warning we get here saying that the navigation mesh is required, it has actually done the pathfinding on that terrain that's come in from there. Okay, and to get rid of that warning, we can just go to the type properties, and we can set minimum inputs to 0. Okay. All right. So now we have a parameter that we can set inside of Unreal that's going to reference the navigation mesh. Okay, so if we wanted to sculpt the terrain in Unreal, then we would need to re-export that terrain and sort of generate this mesh again. I don't want to do that every single time I make a change in Unreal, just because it would be slow for iteration and for the purposes of this tutorial. Okay, so I'm just going to make sure I actually rename that geometry file. I'm going to call that pathfinding geometry file, just to be really verbose. Yeah. No, you know what? Let's just stick with file. And then, oh, is that broken. Oh yeah, it got reset. So Pathfinder mesh, there we go. And then we no longer need to care about input 0 because it's not going to have any issues dealing with the file instead, which means now we only care about how do we actually plug in the curves to input 1. So, okay, let's go ahead and lastly, just for Unreal, it can be helpful to name the inputs in a way that Unreal is going to understand. So we can just call this, yeah, let's just call this one splines, and we can call this one world. And actually, I'm not sure the output name matters, but let's go with that. Okay, so now our Pathfinding HDA has been updated to be usable in the Unreal context. And I'm just going to go ahead and find this file on disk. So I can do that by going to the type properties and going and finding that OTL. Okay. So here it is. And it's the Pegasus terrain pathfinding OTL there, I think. So we need to go back over to Unreal. And now what I can do is actually import that HDA into Unreal. Okay, so we start to see the real power of Houdini inside of Unreal Engine. So we now have access to that whole suite of tools directly inside of Unreal. I'm going to, just before I start messing around with the scriptable tool context, I'm just going to go ahead and right click and go instantiate at the origin. Okay, so we've instantiated our digital asset. It's not creating anything, and that's fine because we haven't actually specified all of the inputs yet. And if we were going to work with this just natively, we would go and set our geometry file to be the pathfinding mesh. Okay, and then we would want to set up a spline input. So you can see we've got our world and our splines input being natively understood by the Houdini engine in Unreal there. And for the splines input, I'm going to go ahead and add a curve input. And then we can see we go all the way down to our little spline, or all the way down to our digital actor there. We've got a spline. So if I just zoom out and then just pull this one over here, going to try that again. Then what I would expect to see here is the terrain pathfinding in action. And if we're not seeing it, then that means that some things have not been correctly configured on inside of our digital asset. So let's jump back over to Houdini and figure out what that might be. I think I potentially already know is that when we were exporting our cache previously to be read in, we were probably creating the attributes for Unreal in this little post-processing step here. So now we need to add this post-processing step inside of the digital asset. So I'm going to go ahead and allow editing. I'm going to cut that out and move this down to underneath out curves. And we would probably have a little switch saying process for Unreal. So switch process for Unreal. And for the time being, we only have the one option, but actually let's just wire this in. Here we go. So this is the Unreal processing step. And I'm going to say that for now, it's going to always be true. Okay. So now we can go ahead and save our node type once more. So that's now been saved to disk. If we go back over to Unreal, I can now go ahead and re-import. And now if I go ahead and hit rebuild all instances, we now get our spline across the terrain. Okay, so this isn't so bad. I can pull this around, and it sort of updates when I move the spline. So it ends up being a little bit slow and sticky, and we don't have a whole load of control. And additionally, I'm not sure how we actually go and add sort of like another spline off to the side, but this is sort of like a perfectly valid way of working with the tool. But we're going to go ahead now and figure out how we can get this kind of like set up and working with sort of the scriptable tool mode and an arbitrary number of inputs. So we just verify that it's working. So I can go ahead and just delete that tool. And you can see, again, another issue with sort of that way of working is it sort of left a sort of slight remnant in the world there. And I'm hoping that this time if I go up to the landscape editing mode and click select all control points and hit delete, it's just going to work. Okay, it did work that time. That's good. But I think that illustrated why we want to use the scriptable tools that sort of manage the state of all of these things a little bit better. Because otherwise you run into weird little bugs like that. So now if we go inside of our tool, Pathfinding Landscape Splines, we're going to want to change a few things. So obviously previously we're instantiating the Houdini BGO import node, which was just one of the kind of raw digital assets provided by Houdini. What we want to be instantiating now is the tool that we've just created, which is Pegasus Terrain Pathfinding. Okay, so we're going to be instantiating that. Compile and save. Straight away, we're going to see that we're setting the file string parameter. And if you remember, inside of Houdini, we actually did just leave the default name to file. But whereas before this was referencing the paths that we were exporting from Houdini and importing to Unreal, this time it's going to be referencing that external terrain cache. Okay. Just for the sake of not accidentally kind of doing a load of weird stuff, I'm going to just temporarily disable the recook over there. So it's not going to do any cooking straight away. And let's just go ahead and see what happens if we run the tool. Well, first of all, you're going to see that there is nothing that gets created because we changed it to create the HDA when we actually hit cook. And you're also going to see that it didn't find a Houdini actor and it's still referencing the old pathfinding splines. There you go, the splines. So let's go ahead and change this over to the pathfinding mesh. So we have a new default. Okay, so you can close the tool, open the tool, and we can see that it's still now referencing that pathfinding mesh. So we have the correct mesh reference saved in the tool. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to figure out how we can send a spline, set that input on the tool so that we can set that kind of guide those curves that are going to get drawn. And the spline is an input to the HDA wrapper. So we've dealt with providing parameters, but we haven't yet dealt with providing inputs. So let's have a little look at how we could do that. And just so that we are clear, we're going to need to send some transforms or a spline data over in that input. So how can we go about doing that? Well, first of all, maybe we just want to create a little spline. So we're just going to create an actor. I'm going to call this BP spline. Going to add a spline to it. There it is. Okay. And we can just drag this temporarily. This is a visualization into the world. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and find the spline points. So I'm just going to drag one over there and one over there. And this is going to be the test spline that I'm going to try to send over to Houdini through the tool. Okay, so we're going to go back to our tool now, and we need to think, how do we go about setting up inputs to the wrapper? So you can see I've created a nice bit of space over here. I'm just going to rewire this in here. There you go, and pull the wrapper reference to the left so we have a bit of space to work. And for the wrapper now, let's have a little look. Let's pull out of here and just see what we can do. We've got input. Okay, so there's quite a lot of things that relate to inputs here. And the one that I think I want to use is going to be create the empty input. Yeah, there we go. And the empty input that I want to create is going to be of type curve input. So, okay, we've now created a curve input. So the next thing we need to do is we need to choose how we provide this input kind of object. You can see this is an input object as an actual input to the tool. And the way we do that is I think we can set the input. There we go. So we can set input parameter. We don't want to do that. We can set inputs at indices, but I just want to set a single input, and that's going to be the input at the index 1. So why am I choosing 1? Well, that's because if we go back to Houdini, the splines come in through input 1. Okay. So then we're creating our input, and we need to wire this input here that we've created. Okay. So we have a curve input being set to input 1 on the wrapper prior to the parameters in the recook. Now the issue is we haven't actually told the input what points the curve should have. So I believe that the way that we can do that is by just using set input objects. I've actually just realized a previous mistake I've made here. Because we're trying to actually grab a spline that exists as an object in the world, we'll no longer be providing the sort of the Houdini native curve inputs to the tool. So we need to go back to the create empty input. We're going to change that to be of type world input. And then we're going to, we're just going to set those input objects. And we're going to pass in an array of objects that are going to be sort of fired over to the tool. So Okay, we need to basically create that array. So I'm going to promote that to a variable. I'm going to call this in curves. Okay, and we create the input. I'm going to actually maybe we should just collapse this to a function to keep things a bit more legible. So let's go ahead and let's just go ahead and do that. That's the function. I ended up with a load of redundant wires, so I'm going to do that. Delete this one. Call that wrapper. I'm going to call the function set inputs, set HDA inputs. There we go. And now we can put that on the wire here. So setting the inputs. And then we can sort this mess out. So it's going to disconnect this for the moment. And here as well. Okay, so create the empty input on the wrapper. We're going to then set the input on the wrapper. So the wrapper is how we actually get the digital asset, you see. Then we're going to create our input there. And then we need to set the input objects. So that's going over here too, actually. So what I'm going to do is just tidy this up again. Do it like so. Okay. So that's now going to set the input at index 1 to be the objects that we supply. So this should probably be coming from outside as well, just to keep things a bit more modular, reusable. Go. And also, because I want this to be a blocking, I'm going to add a return that will only get called when this is finished. Okay. Okay, this all looks good to me. So I just cut the input curves. We've set the input objects, and this should now be all working. So the last thing that remains is we actually just need to make sure that in curves is being created. So let's go once more to our property set. Let's add a new variable, and this is going to be of type objects. And actually, just to keep things even more clean, let's make sure these are of type BP spline. We're going to make sure it's an array. There we go. I'm going to call this curves, or even curve inputs. Make it visible. Okay. And then let's run the tool. We can see that the curve inputs haven't been created yet. We could manually go and hook these up like so, but because we're always going to be using the same inputs for the time being, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that the tool, whenever we run it, just finds all those curves in the world. So I'm going to say set in curves. And I'll actually just do that after the binding of these events here. So we're going to set in curves to be something. What are we going to set it to be? We're going to get all actors of class BP spline. Here we go. So we get all actors of class BP spline. We're going to set that to be in curves. And silly me, I figured out what was wrong. It's because we're actually setting in curves inside of the tool. And remember, if we're dealing with properties that should be exposed to the user, then we need to set them on the property set instead. So I'm going to grab the property set, and then we're going to set the input curves or curve inputs like so. Okay. And I think that actually what that means is we should just go ahead and delete the in curves parameter inside of this tool so that we're only ever dealing with the property set. And then if we go down to the set objects function, we need to now grab that property set and get input curves, get curve inputs. Now we wire that in there and compile, save. Let's go back and run that tool. We can now see that we get the BP spline in the world correctly in that array there. Don't know why I've lost my saved inputs, so I'm just going to re-hook up that pathfinding mesh, and I'm going to go ahead and hit complete. I'm going to run this again, and we can now see that it's retrieved the previous state of the tool again. Okay, so then, last and not least, we actually want, of course, to see if this thing works. So let's go back into the tool once more and re-hook up the recook event and cross our fingers and see what happens. Compile, save, and we're going to go ahead and boot up the splines, We can see we've got our curve input provided. We've got the correct pathfinding mesh. There's no Houdini actor, but that's because it doesn't exist. So we hit recook, creates the pathfinding mesh. It's doing some cooking. It's unfortunately not actually produced any output though. So what could be the issue here? So there could be a number of things going wrong. So let's go and have a little look at the digital asset in the scene and scroll down to the inputs. Okay, so we can actually see that the second input there called splines has now been set to a world input. So that's worked correctly. We can see that the geometry file has been provided and we've got our costs here. So let's just go ahead and do a little recook and see what happens if we force it like so. So just in order to debug this further, and this is a useful step, we're going to go over to Houdini, and inside of our tool, we're going to make sure that we can basically just sort of save this file out, sort of that's coming from Unreal. So we're going to go ahead and do a ROP geometry output, and we're going to save it to the same location we're saving everything else. Okay. And we're going to make sure that we call this something sensible like Unreal test cache.bgo. Okay. So now we just need to promote that button to a button. So we're going to go into the parameter interface. I'm going to grab that button over here. I'm going to save cache, or yeah, save cache input 1. Okay. I'm going to save our digital asset once more. Can go back over to Unreal. I'm going to go ahead and re-import and rebuild all instances. Okay, so we still have our input set up correctly. We still have our other inputs. So we're just going to go ahead and hit cache input 1. Okay, so now if we go back over to Houdini, we can just go ahead and find this file, see what we're dealing with. So we can see that we have got a curve coming over, but what's the issue? Well, the issue seems to be just the sheer number of points that are being created. Let's also check if there's anything wrong with the geometry. No, we do only have one primitive, so that's looking correct. But, oh, we do actually resample this. So, okay. So the resampling seems to be part of the problem because it's actually, you can see that it's resampling. It's not resampling because it's keeping the original geometry. So let's have a little look. Maybe what we want to do is add in a refine, or maybe we can force the tool to just send over the points. So, okay, let's go back over to Houdini, and let's have a little look at the to Unreal, sorry, and let's have a little look at the options that we can set on this spline input, on this geometry input. So let's see if we can set resolution, set Unreal Spline resolution. There we go. So when converting Unreal splines to Houdini curves, okay, so we need to figure out what we're actually wanting to do here. On the export options, we have Unreal Spline resolution. And if we set this to 0, we can set it to only export the control points. Okay, so that's definitely what we want to do. So we're going to set the Unreal Spline resolution. So we go back to the tool pathfinding. I'm going to make sure that we set the Unreal Spline resolution to 0. I think it's that simple in this case. Okay, so we're going to compile and save. And let's go ahead and delete the old one, clear up the scene, and run our tool once more. And then we're going to go ahead and hit recook. And there we have it. Yeah, it just was struggling to deal with the raw number of control points. And this is very exciting now because we have something that looks not too dissimilar to the situation we have inside of Houdini, where if we kind of add more curves to the inputs to the terrain, we're going to see that we get a different result. So, okay, let's have a little look. Let's just wire this in. That's meant to be hooked up still. And I think we can leave the cache on there because it's helpful for debugging, but we can remove this file input there. Let's go ahead and save. And the thing that I was trying to illustrate there is that we can now see that we have this kind of curve input, only it's set up as a spline inside of Unreal. So if we were to exit the tool and go and sort of copy this spline somewhere else, and then run the tool once more and hit recook, you now see that we get these two splines being generated across our terrain. And this is super exciting. Now, the issue is, of course, now how do we actually modify the control points on this spline without exiting the tool? And you can see, because we're inside of this kind of custom scriptable tools mode, we don't have the ability to actually move these points around. So we need to do that via creating our own custom gizmo setup. So that's what we're going to be looking at next.